Go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of in a series of 5 webinars about newspaper digitization that we are hosting with the Connecticut State Library and with help from Connecticut Humanities. We're really glad to have you here today. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I have with me here today Emily Garfinkel, CLHO's Membership and Programs Manager, who's going to be monitoring the chat and kind of queuing up some questions for our presenters. Our real experts with us today are Nicole Besseghir, who's the project coordinator for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project at the Connecticut State Library. She'll be doing the presentation today. I also wanted to let you know that we also have with us from the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project at CSL, Anna Newman, who's the co-director of that project. We are recording. We'll be sending a link to the recording to everyone who registered after the fact. And I know that Nicole has information about the webinars, the future webinars we're planning in this series that she'll talk about a little bit later on. But without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Nicole. Take it away.
Thank you, Amherst. All right, I'm just going to share my screen so we can get going with the PowerPoint. All right. How's that looking for everybody? Good. All right. So as Amherst said, my name is Nicole Besseghir. I am the project coordinator for the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project, which is a grant project for newspaper digitization out of the Connecticut State Library. So I am doing newspaper digitization all day, every day. With CT Humanities and CLHO, we thought it would be a great idea to share just our knowledge, our experience with everyone, to help you guys kind of jumpstart your newspaper digitization projects, to help you learn more what's involved with these projects and kind of how to manage a project like this. So as Amherst said, we're going to have 5 webinars, and we've split up the various topics involved in a digitization project across these webinars so as not to do information overload. So today I'm talking about title selection and newspaper format. So what do you have? What do you digitize is the name of this one. And so we decided to go with this topic first, because it's kind of some of the very first things you're going to be considering when you're taking on one of these projects. So other parts of the projects will be talked about in the later webinar, so don't worry if this feels like, obviously we're not covering everything that would be involved in a project today. So no worries, we'll get to those in later webinars, and I'll share those dates for those webinars and which topic will be covered in each webinar at the end. All right, so getting started. So what I have here on this slide is a series of questions that you can ask yourself about your titles and the newspaper format to help you kind of get your project started and start thinking about the various aspects of your project. So those are the first things you want to think about. What newspapers you have, what format are those newspapers in, and then think about making your selections for digitization. So you'll start out thinking about what you have. What newspaper titles do you or your partner institution have? What are the formats of those newspapers? Are they print or are they microfilm? Do you have full runs of those newspapers? Do you have all of the issues for all the years that it was published, or do you have some gaps? So that's one place you want to start. Then you'll start thinking about, what do you want to digitize? How are you going to select titles if you can't digitize everything that you have? Or if you are able to digitize everything you have because it's not a large volume or because you have lots of funding, the big dream, how are you going to choose an order for digitization? Because even if you're digitizing everything, you still want to make a conscious decision about what order you're doing your digitization. When you're thinking about what you're going to digitize, do you need to select based on the format? Do you need to make your selections based on format? For whatever reason, is print or microfilm, one or the other, going to be better for you? Does that need to play a part in your selection? And then how do you handle your originals, print and microfilm, during this investigation stage? That doesn't necessarily play a part in digitization, but it's an important thing. So I'm going to quickly go over handling later on. And then the last thing you'll be thinking about in this kind of getting started phase is, where are the newspapers? For your microfilm, you'll want to know where the master negatives are, which I'll talk more about that in a minute if you're working from microfilm. And then if you have gaps, either in microfilm or print newspapers, you're going to want to figure out, are those missing issues? Are they available elsewhere? So basically with my talk today, I'm going to go over how you can go about answering all these questions, or thinking about the different aspects of that these questions cover. All right, so first up, title review and selection. So as part of doing your title review, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you're aware of all the newspapers in existence for your town, if you're doing a broader region, and their full run, how long they were published for. So check your inventories and catalogs for your institution, or if you know that you'll be borrowing from a partner institution, check their inventories and catalogs. Check other local libraries and archives in your immediate area, or the immediate area of where the paper was published. There's also the directory of U.S. newspapers and American libraries that the Library of Congress has, and this is a really nice resource. Now, this resource is created based off of catalog records, so which go into OCLC WorldCat. So if you are a historical society or another small organization that you don't actually have a catalog with MARC records, your newspapers might not appear in the directory because they pull from catalog records, but this will help give you an idea of other places, what they have. So that's, I don't have links to this this later. The directory is actually being, well, Library of Congress is actually doing a full update of a lot of things, a lot of their databases. So there are currently 2 links to the directory, the old version and the new version, and I'll give you both of those links later on in the presentation. So once you figured out what papers even existed in your area, then you're going to want to look at what format those papers are in, either at your institution and your partner institutions. Are they print or microfilm? And then you're going to determine if all the years are available. So you already looked up what was the full run of the newspaper, how long was it published, and whether it was published weekly, daily. So then with that information, you need to look at your collection, your partner institution's collections, and say, okay, do we have all the issues that were actually published in those years? Or are there gaps in our collection or the partner institution's collections? Go ahead and determine that up front. So then once you've reviewed your titles and you know what's available where and what format, you can start thinking about your selection. So you want to decide what criteria to use for title selection, or if you're not going to have to do a selection, you can digitize everything. You still want to have criteria for ordering what order you're going to digitize the papers in. So you want to look at both informational and historical value of your papers. So some criteria that you can look at, there are a variety. These are just some. You can look at your longest running titles. Sometimes it can be really beneficial to do those up front, or sometimes you want to do your longest running titles later. Like maybe you'll do your newspaper titles that had shorter runs or weren't published as often, so like your weeklies, maybe you want to do those up front, and then your longer dailies you want to wait and do later, and you can flip-flop it either way. You want to consider your especially significant papers, whether it was the big name paper in your town, or say you had another smaller paper that always presented a really unique viewpoint, supported a different viewpoint than your larger paper. Think about things like that. The largest paper in your town may not have always been the most significant paper. Other papers might have had a lot of significance as well. So look at that. And a similar criteria, most popular titles. Again, that could have been the largest paper in your town, but it could have also been some really like niche paper in your town. Look at what's most popular, what people talk about the most when they talk about historic papers in your town. The age, your oldest papers might also be something that's another criteria for either selection or digitization order. You might want to do your oldest papers first, because a lot of times those are the hardest to access. Even if they've been microfilmed, older papers can be very hard to read on microfilm. Anyone who's worked with 19th century newspapers knows that they often printed as much as they could on the page, 10, 12 columns across the page, really small font, and that can be difficult to read on microfilm. So there might be a lot of benefit to digitizing those either first, or if you have to make a selection, choosing those over a more modern paper. And then also think about research use, research value. Again, your older papers could carry a lot of research value, or you might have a 20th century paper that's more, rich for research. And think about your different groups that are doing research. Your genealogists obviously are a big one, but you've got people who are doing other types of historic research. They may be doing, more like social research or socioeconomic, or, big events in your town. Maybe somebody's researching a specific event. You've also got, students, educators are becoming a bigger research group with historic newspapers. So just think of, the research value, the research use, and, what titles if some titles might be more ripe for research than others, depending on their coverage. So things to consider. So these are some things you want to think about when you're reviewing the titles, what information you want to gather as you review your newspaper titles, and then what you want to think about as you're having to make selection or your priorities for digitization. All right, so I'm already mentioning a lot format. Format is going to be a big player in your digitization project. It could play a part in your title selection. What format is available could affect what papers you decide to digitize. So you've got two formats, print and microfilm. Some quick differences other than the obvious about print and microfilm when it comes to digitization. Print is typically more expensive to digitize and can be more challenging logistically to digitize. As we all know, newspapers are large. They're a large format. So that means they need certain equipment to be digitized. That's typically more expensive for the vendor to operate, either large scale scanners or a camera setup. And so it's not as much of an automated process, so it's more expensive. And then also a large format material takes more handling. That makes logistical challenges. And also newspapers can be very fragile, so also presents logistical challenges. Microfilm is less costly to digitize because that's more of an automated process. They have a machine that they put the microfilm reel on that does the scanning. And then a lot of work is done. All the post work is what is more involved, which is, it's the same for print. The work that's actually done after the scanning is typically, they have the same level of involvement. It's the actual scanning process that's different. And microfilm can require special equipment depending on what examination you're going to do of the microfilm physically before you digitize. If you're going to do any quality readings on the microfilm, it's not necessary for you to do that. Your vendor can do that for you and then share those readings with you. But if that's something you're interested in doing, then you're going to need special equipment. So that could affect the cost as well. Goes without saying, the better the quality of your originals, whether print or microfilm, the better your scans are going to come out. So that's something to remember if you're trying to choose between print or microfilm. If you have both, if your papers at the time that they were microfilmed, they were in really good condition, but now they're not in so great condition, you might want to consider your microfilm more for digitization because it captured a better quality image of the paper at the time. And some notes about microfilm quality specifically, you want to use the film that's in the best condition, which is typically going to be your master or second generation negative, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And then if you've got older microfilm, it's likely acetate and deteriorating. So those are some things that are going to affect microfilm quality specifically, and I'll talk more about those in just a minute. So now I'm going to go into detail for both formats. I'm going to talk about microfilm and then print, and things that you need to be aware of when digitizing each one. So just a refresher, I'm sure most people know this already, but microfilm is created by using a camera to take an image of documents, and the film that is in the camera when the image is taken is what comes out as the master negative. So that's the microfilming process. Common types of microfilm include nitrate, acetate, and polyester. Acetate and polyester microfilm are the most common. Hopefully you don't have nitrate film in your collections. It's extremely unstable, and it's usually marked as like nitrate film. It needs to be stored in extremely cold conditions because it is combustible on its own, doesn't need anything to start a fire. So if you have nitrate film, don't even consider it for digitization. I would not recommend considering it for digitization. I'm not going to go into a lot about nitrate film. It's pretty uncommon in microfilm collections. If you know you have nitrate film, if you have questions about nitrate film, you can reach out to me and I can point you to some specific resources on handling nitrate film. But hopefully you don't have any, because it's not good. Acetate film is what was being used initially in microfilming projects. And as time went on, and polyester film was developed, it was determined that polyester film actually has a better shelf life than acetate film. So acetate film has a preservation shelf life of anywhere 50 to 100 years. Actually not very long. A lot of acetate film has actually started to deteriorate before it's even reached its shelf life. Acetate film, it's starting to deteriorate, or you have acetate film if you open a film box or canister and you smell vinegar. You have acetate film, it has vinegar syndrome, which means it's starting to deteriorate. Polyester film, you won't get that smell, and it has a preservation shelf life of 500 years. Acetate film was used unfortunately through the 60s and 70s, even though polyester film was already in existence at that point. It probably wasn't until late 70s, early 80s that polyester film became more of like the standard for microfilming, especially for preservation. So there is a chance that some of your master negatives will be on acetate. So that's going to be something that you'll need to consider. You can certainly digitize acetate film. You just need to be aware that if it's already started to deteriorate, it could break during the scanning process. But if you let your vendor know, your vendor will know when they get the film that it's acetate, but you can also warn them, and they try to, they take precautions to make sure that, to try to make sure it doesn't get damaged. But part of the deterioration process with acetate film is that it becomes brittle. So sometimes it can only be used so many times before it can't handle the use anymore. Your polyester film is sturdier, stronger, so you don't have any those sort of worries when you're digitizing from a master or second generation negative that's polyester. So speaking of I keep talking about master, second generation. So what it is there are versions of the microfilm. So like I said, the film that was in the camera at the time that the image was taken in the documents is the master negative. The master negative is the original of your microfilm. You cannot make another master negative. It came from the camera. So it is, it's one of the best, it's the best for scanning. The second generation or preservation negative was created directly from the master negative, and it's also best for scanning. If you have access, if second generation negatives have been created for your masters or for the masters that you're borrowing, then you actually would want to use those potentially over the master, because since the master is the original and irreplaceable, it would be great not to subject it to any use other than creating more copies. So if you can use the second generation negative, that's good too. The service copy, which is a positive film, is best for reviewing the content on the reels. The service copy is what you're going to find in your library, in your reading room. That may be the copies that you have at your institution. It should be the copies. You typically do not use service copies for scanning. The only exceptions will be If a master negative is lost or unavailable due to cost, then you could consider using your service copies for scanning if they're in good condition. So if there is a chance that master negatives are lost, that they were not maintained in storage. And then there are some places, some vendors that store master negatives that charge a pool fee for you to use the negatives, and that cost can be quite high, and it might not be reasonable for you to pay the pool fees for the masters for your project. And in that case, it's acceptable to consider using your service copies if they're in good condition. And I'm going to talk more about how you find the masters, and go about getting those to use for digitization in just a couple minutes. So another consideration with microfilm is, like I said, the better the quality of your originals, the better quality of your scans. So some film quality aspects with microfilm. There are different readings for microfilm that quality readings that you can take that give you an idea of the quality of the film physically. One of these is the reduction ratio, and the way that reading is recorded is 20x, 19x. That's the way it's recorded. If microfilm was created following the national standards that started being used in the 80s, then the reduction ratio is typically listed on the reel itself. If it's not, what you can do is you can look at the film, and when you're looking at the film, the service copy on the microfilm reader, look at how large or small the page appears to be. And do you have to zoom in a lot not because your reader is small, but because you can't see the text, you really have to zoom in. That can give you an idea of the reduction ratio. You won't get an exact number, but essentially the reduction ratio is how close the camera was to the newspaper while it was being filmed. And you want the camera to not be too far from the original, or else the image is going to be very small on the microfilm, which makes it very difficult to read. So the ideal is that it's less than 20x. And the higher, going over 20 means the image is smaller because the camera was further away. So ideally, you don't want it to go over 20x. But if you can still reasonably see the the font on the newspaper, then you could consider still using that microfilm for digitization, as long as it's not just completely unreadable, excuse me, because obviously scanning is also going to make it easier to zoom in to magnify the text. That's one reading that's especially important during digitization. There are some other quality readings that you can take of microfilm. However, they require specialized equipment. So I'm not necessarily recommending that folks do those readings, because it would require you likely to purchase equipment. If you already have the equipment to do these things, then you could take the readings. But your vendor is capable of taking these other readings, and most vendor, as part of their quality control process before they digitize your microfilm, will take those readings, and they can share those readings with you. But it's just something to be aware of. There are physical readings of the microfilm that tell you about the quality. And then the storage conditions and film type obviously can also affect the quality of your film. So if your masters or second generation negatives have not been stored in cool enough conditions, if the conditions were too humid, then that's going to affect the quality of the film. The film could have started deteriorating. It could be buckling, which would affect the images. And then obviously, if you've got acetate film, once the vinegar syndrome sets in, eventually the film will be affected in a way that the quality of the images on the film goes down. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so now if you're looking at print, oh, and I neglected to say at the beginning, there will be plenty of time at the end for questions. So, we'll go over everything. All the questions that we have. So now, if you're looking at digitizing from print, here are some things that you want to keep in mind. There are some characteristics of newspapers, print newspapers, that are going to affect digitization. One of the big ones is that newspapers were printed on cheap, low quality paper, known as newsprint. Obviously, newspaper publishers were trying to keep their costs low in an effort to make more profit. So one of the ways to do that was, keep your cost of supplies low. So they were not using, the best paper out there. So that cheap, low quality paper does not hold up well. It doesn't preserve well. Also, another reason they were using this cheap paper is that newspapers are single-use items. They're not meant to be a permanent record. So newspapers have not been created to be preserved long term. They're literally an item that's printed to get the news of the day out, and then once it's old news, you don't need the newspaper anymore, right? So these two characteristics of newspapers contribute to the quality of your newsprint, of your newspapers directly. And so just something to keep in mind as to why, your newspapers have not held up over the years and may not look, the way that they did originally. Some other factors about newspapers that you'll need to consider when you're looking from digitizing from print are the age of the newspaper. Obviously, an older paper could potentially have more wear. It's been read more, it's been handled more, or it could just not be in great shape due to its age. And then the condition. Like I said, that low quality paper is going to deteriorate. Even in the best archival storage, newspaper is only going to live for so long. It gets hard to maintain it because that paper is not preservation quality. So look at the condition of your papers. Are your papers already fragile? Are they, is the paper brittle? Do you already have damage to them? These are things to consider, especially if you have the option of choosing between your print and microfilm. You need to really look at these things. And maybe if your papers are really old and you don't want to have additional handling, if the condition's already not great, you might want to lean towards using the microfilm for digitization. The storage method of your newspapers could also play into digitization if they're bound or loose. Bound newspapers, if your bound volume doesn't open and lay flat when it's open, then your digitization vendor is likely going to want to unbind those volumes. And it all depends on the way that the bound volume was made as to what's going to be entailed. If it was bound with a string method or with the metal fasteners, those can be undone without extreme damage, but there still could be damage to the paper. If it was bound with glue, the only option is going to be to slice off some of the spine of the binding, which is going to essentially cut off part of your newspaper. Hopefully not your text block, because they shouldn't have bound up right up to the text when they did that, but you never know. There are not strict standards for binding. So that's something to consider. If your newspapers are bound and you have the option of going with microfilm instead, I would almost always recommend your microfilm, because unbinding newspapers, even the ones that you don't have to cut them to unbind them, is going to cause damage. And then when you're done with the digitization, you have to make the decision, well, how are we going to store these going forward after digitization? If your newspaper is loose, you don't have that issue of, are we going to damage it in the unbinding? But loose newspapers have their challenges too. They could be a little bit harder to pack up to send out to your vendor. They're more likely to be damaged or, deteriorate in shipping because they're not protected by a tight binding. So just some things to consider with your print and digitizing from print. Another thing you want to think about too is the uniqueness and historical value of your print newspapers. Are your print newspapers the only print copy of that paper in a library archive? If you know that you have the only print copies of a paper, you have the only full print run of that paper, that's a valuable asset in your collection. And again, if you have the option of digitizing from microfilm and you have the only print copies of a newspaper, I would strongly urge you to lean towards the microfilm, because having the only surviving print copy of a newspaper is an asset. That's something important. You're the last copy, the last physical copy of that newspaper that could be accessed, and that's important as well. So keep that in mind. And then you're going to think about, do you have a complete run or just single issues of your print newspaper? Again, if you have a full complete run in print and you don't have to digitize from your print, I think that's, you know, something you want to consider, because again, that complete run, and if you're the only one who has that complete run, that's a valuable asset. And if you only have single issues in print and the full run is on microfilm, it might be better to just stick to the microfilm and only use your print to fill in any gaps that are on the microfilm. So just some things that you need to think about when you're working with your print newspapers for digitization, and considerations that you need to make if you're trying to choose between digitizing print or microfilm. And there are instances, excuse me, there are instances where a run of a newspaper might be split between print and microfilm. Say only, 50 years of the newspaper were microfilmed and there are another 20 years available print, or you have the full run in print and only 50 years were microfilmed. I would still digitize the 50 years that are on microfilm and then use the remaining years that are in print. I would still start with the microfilm so that you handle as few of your print issues as possible. You may have an instance where you've got full runs both in print and in microfilm. You may have a full run of microfilm and only some issues in print. And so then you just need to, make these considerations. My recommendation is typically to start with the microfilm, just to maintain the condition and of your print copies. But if you run into an instance of having difficulty borrowing masters or locating masters, and your service copies aren't in very good condition, they're beat up from being used in the library microfilm reader, then obviously print might be a better choice for you. So it's all circumstantial. If you're in this conundrum, you're trying to weigh your options, and you need just some advice or just to bounce some ideas off the wall, always feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end. For CDMP, we always digitize from microfilm, but for other projects that I've worked on, I've digitized from print. So I know the differences that you're going to have in digitizing each format and kind of the considerations that you need to make with working with each. So while you're reviewing, while you're reviewing all of your originals, whether print or microfilm, and you're making these decisions, you need to think about how you're handling these during review. So if you've got print newspapers that you're reviewing, that you're looking through, you want to have clean, dry hands while you're handling those newspapers. I know gloves are really popular, but actually when you're handling newspapers and other textual documents, you actually want to skip the gloves. Gloves make it to where you can't grip as well and you lose dexterity. So especially with newspapers, you can actually end up causing damage if you have gloves on. So a better, and this is a practice among archivists, this is not just something I'm saying, this is considered best practice among archivists. Wash your hands before handling the material and make sure they're nice and dry. And after a while, you'll sometimes, print newspaper leaves like a residue on your hand, go wash your hands again, take a break, wash your hands again. But I would skip the gloves. That's not the case for all historic materials, but for newspapers especially, skip the gloves. You want to be mindful of crumbling around the edges for any brittle pages that you might have. And just, know that that's probably the case in some of your newspapers, and be aware of that and keep that in mind as you're looking through them and handling them. And so you'll want to turn your pages gently and slowly. Even if you're just doing something like trying to count pages or look at something really briefly, just go slow. Don't go fast with your newspapers, especially anything older. Now, when you're handling master negatives of newspaper on film, it's a little bit different. You will wear gloves because when you're handling negatives, photographs, the oils on your hands and your fingerprints can show up. And so you wear the gloves to, keep that from happening. And these this material is not brittle the way a newspaper is, not as fragile. So you're not in as much danger of causing a rip or a tear from having a glove on as you are with paper material. So wear those gloves. I like nitrile gloves. They're typically like blue or purple, not latex. They're not latex. They're called nitrile, and they look like some medical professionals wear them. You can wear white cotton gloves as well. Make sure that they're clean. If you wear those nitrile gloves are disposable. So once they start to look dirty, you toss them and put on a new pair. Don't unwind the master negative reel without the proper equipment unless absolutely necessary. So anybody who's worked with microfilm might be familiar with a reel winder, and it's basically got a winder. It's usually on a long piece of like wood or set up on a table, and each end has like a handle and a case for the reel to put the reel on. And you put the reel on one end, you pull the end of the reel and take it out to the other handle and winder, and then you use the handles to unwind the film. I'm like gesturing, you guys can't actually see my hands, but so you're not actually touching the film to unwind it. It's hooked up on the winder, and you're using handles to crank the winder and unwind the film. This is so that you're not touching the master. It's not touching a surface. You know, this is usually suspended a little above your table. It's ideal that you're not handling the master, especially with bare hands, but also touch it as little as possible. And it's not sitting on a surface where it could scratch, and you don't want dust or dirt to get on it. So that's why you don't want to unwind it unless you actually have the winder to put it on, so that it doesn't like fall all over your table or on the floor as you start to unwind. So try not to unwind it unless you have that equipment. You typically don't have a need to unwind the film, the masters, unless you are wanting to do those quality readings on the physical traits of the film. But if you are doing that, you would have obtained the equipment that you need to do so. So then you can unwind. But anything in unwinding, you should be doing with the service copy and a microfilm reader. Do not ever stick a master negative or a second generation negative into a microfilm reader. Never, 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 never. Your service copies will have been copied from a master negative, so they should be exactly the same as what's on the master negative. So there's no need to stick your master negative into a microfilm reader to see what's on it. If you have a reel winder, you can put it on there. You can have a light box underneath it if you want to double check and make sure everything that you think is on there is on there. But if you don't have that equipment, don't try to look at the contents of the film. Leave that to your vendor. We'll talk more about how you check the contents of the film in a later webinar. But please don't put your masters or second generation negatives in the microfilm reader. You'll scratch them. They'll be damaged. They'll be overly handled. You don't want to do that. And remember, the masters are the originals and are not replaceable. So handle them very carefully. If something happens to the master, if it's ripped, if it's scratched, there's no other way to recreate that. And so then every copy of the film that gets made from then on out will have been affected by that damage. It's not as common, obviously, to make microfilm copies anymore, but there could be an instance where somebody wants a new service copy. That's not to say that service copies should not be handled carefully, but they are made to be used. And again, if the master exists or a preservation negative, another service copy can be made if something were to happen to a service copy at a library in a reading room. So obviously handle them, nicely, but you don't have to worry about putting them into a reader. That's what they're made for. All right. So I'm talking a lot about master second generation negatives. This is what you want to digitize from if possible. But this is not the copies of the microfilm that are going to be located at your library, at your historical society, whatever institution you're coming from, your archive. Likely you're not storing the master negative unless you have a lot of cold storage, then maybe they're located on site. If they're not, and you need to locate those, first you need to determine the owner and the vendor. So the owner, who had the newspapers microfilmed? Whoever paid for the newspapers to be microfilmed is technically the owner of the masters. This is not the same as owning the copyright of a newspaper. We're going to talk about copyright next week. That's something different. We're saying who owns the master negatives, who paid for the newspaper to be microfilmed, and what vendor created the film. This information might be on the service copy. If the newspapers were microfilmed according to the national standards, which became widely used in the 1980s, then at the beginning of the film, there's typically the vendor's logo or a placard with their name, and they might say who the paper was filmed for. A popular vendor in the region is New England Micrographics. Their logo is always on the box containing the microfilm reel and on the reel itself, and they also say who they created it for. And if the film reel was created by New England Micrographics and it doesn't say who it was created for, they know they should have a record of who they created it for, so you can contact them to find that out. If the service copy doesn't have that information, check institutional records. So if you have copies and you think that you had the newspaper microfilm, check your records. See if you have any information about it being microfilmed. See if you know what vendor it was, because if it was microfilm before the standards were in wide use, the vendors didn't always put their name on stuff, which is amazing. You would think they would want the credit, but unfortunately there is some film that it's hard to determine who the vendor is or who it was filmed for. If it's not your film, maybe you have just service copies at your institution, but you know that you guys did not create it, then talk to your local library or the library in town of publication and be like, did this microfilm come from you guys? Do you know if you guys had these newspapers microfilmed? Just have that conversation. And if this is, you're hitting walls initially with this, just keep investigating. You can also go back to the U.S. Directory of Newspapers and American Libraries, which I'm going to link at the end, but I mentioned in the beginning. That will also list, in addition to information about the newspaper, like the background information, publishing dates and things like that. It also, the Library of Congress also keeps a inventory of libraries that hold newspapers. And again, though, there are certain institutions that may not show up in this directory if you don't actually catalog your holdings in a database that ends up with OCLC. But if you're still struggling to find information about who might own the film and what vendor, you can see who has copies of the microfilm, and then you could reach out to them and see are these your, is this your film, or did you get the copies from someone else? That could help you investigate some. So once you've determined who the owner and the vendor are, you need to move on to getting permission to use the negatives, and then determining their location so that you can physically get them. So you need to ask the owner if you can use the master second generation negative for digitization. If you know, or if the owner already knows that the masters are acetate, you do need to, include in the conversation that damage could occur even for polyester film, damage could occur. It's going to be wear and tear, during digitization. So make sure that that's discussed just in case, God forbid anything happens. They know that chance exists. Typically, for CDMP with the state library, we've never had an owner tell us we couldn't use the negatives, because the ability to make the newspapers more accessible outweighs the possible damage to the microfilm. And we're going to provide another, means of preservation. So even if the microfilm is less usable, they're being preserved digitally now as well. So some things to consider if you're having that conversation with the owner and there are those worries. And then if you haven't already determined based off of the vendor or the owner having the masters, ask them if they know where they're located, if they're not storing them. If not, look at the service copy again for the vendor, and they might be storing the masters. New England Micrographics, like I said, they're a common microfilm vendor for the region. They typically store the masters that they create for the institutions that they created them for. A lot of microfilm companies have gone out of business. Obviously, microfilm is not as popular. So if they were storing masters, they were likely moved somewhere. There's a chance they were moved to New England Micrographics. The institution could have taken them over. So that's a conversation that, if you find out that a company that looks like it's out of business is the one who did the filming, then talk to the owning institution. Or if it's yourself, look in your records, see if you have any record, or if they have any record of where the masters were moved, if they were being stored by a company that's no longer in business. And as I mentioned earlier, in that case, sometimes as microfilm companies went out of business, there are other companies that are more for-profit companies that came in and purchased master negatives from companies going out of business. And now they store those negatives. And unfortunately, some of these larger companies, they charge very high pool fees to get the masters out of storage and to use them. I mean, we're talking anywhere from $200 to $1,000 per reel. I've seen people quoted. It's never the same number. They calculate their pool fee based on the title, the area that it's from, that sort of thing. So if that's the case, if these masters are now stored somewhere that charges high fees to pool them and use them, then you want to think about either using your service copies if they're in good enough shape, or if you have print, you might want to consider your print as well. Oftentimes some service copies are in good enough shape. Some libraries, their service copies have been really loved and used, so they may not be in great condition. So it's going to be situational. Again, if you find yourself in one of these situations, you've identified that your masters are being stored by a vendor who charges very high fees. Now, that vendor is not necessarily the owner of the masters, but because they're storing them, they charge these fees, and you don't know where to go from there. You're unsure what to do. That's the sort of, I'm happy to give advice or just help you walk through that. If you reach a dead end, you're not sure who the owner is, or you can't figure out the vendor, or you just can't figure out anything with storage, any of this, if any of this is, you're coming up blank going through all these questions, you can reach out to us at the state library to see if we have any information. As part of both microfilming that went on for some 20 odd years at the state library, and as part of CDNP, we've researched a lot of newspapers and holdings. And so we do have some running list, and we might be able to find some information about either who an owner is or what vendor created the film and potentially is storing it. So if you have just come up with blanks with all of these avenues, then you can reach out to us and we can see if we have any information that we can share. So that's the end of talking about title selection and your formats. Like I mentioned, there are more webinars in this series. So today we started out with these two topics, which are obviously very closely related, as you can see. Next week on Friday, we're going to talk about copyright and permissions. Can you legally digitize? And we're going to have a guest speaker, Hope O'Keefe, Senior General Counsel at the Library of Congress. And we're going to be talking specifically about newspaper copyright. So we will not be able to provide information about any other copyright issues for other things you might be trying to digitize from your collection. This is going to be specifically about newspaper copyright, the ins and outs of that. And then on October 6th, we're going to talk more about planning and working with vendors. How do you digitize? Both how do you plan out your project, how do you manage your project, and then what it's like working with your vendors, what you need to think about with vendors. And then on October 20th, we're going to talk about what you do with this digitized content. How do you share your digitized newspapers? So digital preservation and repositories and all the things you need to consider for that. And then our last webinar is going to be roundtable style, ask your peers. We're going to have folks who have done newspaper digitization projects and can share their experience. We'll have a guided conversation, but then we'll also have time for questions and for folks to ask, things that might be related to their project. This is my contact information. This will go out in the follow-up email as well. You can email me with any questions that you have about what I discussed today. If you have questions about the upcoming webinars, if something that you have a question about is going to be covered in those, feel free to reach out. If you already know that the state library has microfilm, your newspaper's on microfilm, and you would like to borrow it, whether it be service copies or masters, you can contact Anna Newman for that, our co-director. And then we also have a webpage, Digitizing the Newspapers of Connecticut, that has information that I shared with you today, as well as information that's going to be in the future webinars. We're actually in the process of updating those pages, so don't panic if you visit the page and it doesn't cover something that I mentioned today. It will get updated, but also, as always, if you have a question, you don't see something covered that I discussed, or you just have a question about anything I mentioned, you can reach out. And then I mentioned the directory of U.S. newspapers. There are 2 links here for that because the Library of Congress is updating their databases. So I've linked, we'll send out the link for the old database and then the new database. Eventually the old one will be defunct, but right now it's still up because they haven't fully migrated. So that is it for me. And like I said, this information will go out. So don't worry if you are not able to like copy down the links, but I'm going to stop sharing so that I can actually see things. Oh, Anna
Great.
has, I see Anna's
Yeah.
provided links in the chat. So now we'll move on to questions. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions.
Excellent. Well, we have a number that have come through in the chat. So if you don't mind, Nicole, I'm going to lob a few of those your way.
Sure.
And then we'll probably have time for some live questions or additional ones.
Yeah.
So we have someone here who's sitting in on behalf of a local newspaper where she used to work and was curious if there's any potential revenue for a newspaper that digitizes its historic holdings. She doesn't think the newspaper itself would be interested in hosting the digitized images, and so is interested about in thinking about how they might get the stuff online. And I think the larger context of this, based on the things that she's been messaging me about, and might also be relevant to some of the other folks on this call, is that they're getting a lot of pressure from a local history organization, perhaps a local historical society, and the newspaper's trying to get its ducks in a row around copyright, who owns the master negatives, costs, benefits, potential revenue. So I think there's, Barb has a bunch of questions embedded in there about, how a newspaper that's still in print might go about this process.
Yeah.
That might be different from what some of the local
Yes.
historical societies might be thinking about. But I also think there's a bigger question in here about, because I've seen this when I've gone out on the road, local historical societies who are trying to figure out effective ways of working with a local newspaper that's still running and in operation, about how to make its historical holdings accessible to a researching public. So what are some of the ways that those organizations might work together? And if you have more specific answers to some of Barb's questions around, what might be in it for the newspaper, that would be really helpful.
Well, the newspaper itself, if they're interested in taking on digitization, but maybe the cost is too high, they don't have that revenue to pay because digitization can get very expensive. One avenue that they can consider is newspapers.com. Newspapers.com works directly with publishers. We are not going to discuss newspapers.com a lot in these webinars because we're looking at other options, and we have a local hosting site that we work with at the state library. So that's who the Connecticut Digital Archive. So we'll look at them more. But a popular model for publishers is to go directly with newspapers.com. If they're not interested in working with newspapers.com, then yes, I think it's not a bad idea to form a partnership with a local organization. And the local organization would typically be a nonprofit or a public entity as library. They are able to go out for grant funding if funds are the issue. Obviously, the newspaper themselves as a for-profit entity may not be eligible for grant funding for digitization, depending on the granting body. But they could partner with their local organizations and nonprofit public institutions and seek funding that way. And then also just logistically, the newspaper itself, they are the publisher, they are the copyright holder, and we'll talk about more about copyright obviously next week, but the newspaper can grant permission for the paper to be digitized, even if it's still under copyright. They just give that permission. They just write a letter, some sort of permissions. And then they can work with the local organization. I mean, who's got it on microfilm or who has the print copies, and they can work out. And the local organization, might be able to take on the labor. That's what you have to decide, who's going to take on labor. Who's going to work with the vendors. And if the local organization is able to, the newspaper, the publisher might be able to work out with the local organization where they're doing a lot of the logistical administrative work, and whereas the publisher themselves, they're giving the permission and they're providing whatever other support that they can. I am not aware of any partnerships like that have happened in Connecticut, but it may just be that I'm not aware of them. But I have heard of other states having these partnerships, or newspapers in other states having such partnerships, and there may be some in Connecticut that I'm just not aware of. There are newspapers in Connecticut that have made their historic issues available, obviously, like the Hartford Current. They handle that all themselves. So there may be, I'm not aware if those papers that are historically available where it's been the publisher doing it, I don't know if they've worked with their local organizations or not, but a partnership like that is certainly possible, and it's valuable, and that's going to be very situational. So I will say, I don't know that these webinars will provide a full kind of path for you guys if you're seeking a partnership like that, but there are definitely, I think, things that you'll be able to take from these webinars that can help you build a path. That could also be an instance where hopefully if your local organization is all volunteer staff, or they don't have a professional archivist on hand, this could also be a consultant sort of situation as well. So lots to think about, and it's certainly possible.
Yeah, and if I might add, Nicole, as well, I mean, just jumping in here, and what I sort of understand about the situation is some of the things that I've seen out on the road. I think that one of the things that can be challenges, the newspaper is thinking about this in a profit mindset, and the historical society or the library is probably thinking about this in a access and public service mindset. And I think there are ways to bring those together, especially if the publisher can think less about what, the nickels and dimes, and more about the public service to the community.
Yes.
And the value that its subscribing public might see if they're able to say, look, we've just made, the last 100, the 100 years of the newspaper leading, before 1950, available online. You can look up articles about your grandparents. That's something that would have great value to a subscriber base, and might have, might really do a good PR, for the publisher as well.
Yes.
So I think that that's another thing that I might encourage, to be a part of the conversation when nonprofits and publishers are trying to work together toward arrangements. There was a question from Christine about second generation, copies. How do you know if the microfilm copy that you have is a second generation negative or not?
So if you're the copy that you have in your reading room should not be a negative, or in your library, it should not be a negative. It should be a positive copy. So that should typically be a service copy. But say you have some copies in storage and they're negatives. Typically vendors, there's typically a difference in the container for a master versus any other copies created. So your master is typically going to be in either a plastic kind of like box, and it is a archival grade, preservation grade plastic. So if it was created by New England Micrographics, their containers are preservation grade, so don't worry that it's plastic. So it'd either be like that, it might be in a metal canister, some sort of metal container. But in terms of looking at the film itself, you actually should not be able to tell the difference between your master and your second generation negative.
But if you have a positive, it's not second generation.
If you have a positive, it's not a second generation negative. It's not a preservation copy.
And if it's in a paper box like you would see at the library, it's probably not a second generation.
So second generation negatives could be in a paper box, but again, they would be negative. So if you've got something in a paper box at your institution and you've been storing it in cold storage, it could be a second generation negative. But if you know for a fact that you don't have anything stored anywhere else, then you might have your master. So that's just, I can, if that person wants to email, I can let them know of some resources that they can look at to examine the microfilm more closely. I didn't go into those details today because it's very detailed. So you really get down into it, but there are some resources available, some books, some resources from NEDCC to help you when you're looking at your microfilm to kind of tell, about the physical qualities of it. And then also, if you have masters stored with a vendor, and then they also have your preservation or second generation negatives, they should know the difference. Your vendor should know which set is your masters and which set is your second generation negatives. Some places have those, like the state library, our standard is we don't store our masters and our second generation negatives in the same facility. So that is also too something you could run into.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Christine, if you have follow-up questions on them, just pop them in, or or you can raise your hand later. So Leah has a number of questions which I'll put to you in order. So the first is, how likely is microfilm to hit 300 PPI and therefore support accurate OCR?
So microfilm, especially if it was filmed following the national standards that really came into use in the 1980s, will absolutely hit the 300 PPI DPI in scanning, and has good OCR capabilities. Even microfilm that was not filmed to those standards you can produce 300 PPI DPI scans from that film. Your OCR quality could be affected, but honestly, it's not just the quality of the film that's going to affect. It's also going to be the size of the font on the paper, which if you're using print or microfilm, that size of the font could play into your OCR quality in the end. Basically, if the paper was in good condition when it was microfilmed, that's really going to make a difference in what a PPI DPI you can end up getting out. And any vendor, which we'll talk about this later in a later webinar, your vendor should be scanning at 300 or 400 PPI DPI. So anything less than that is going to give you terrible OCR. But microfilm, I mean, that is the Library of Congress, their standards for newspaper digitization is to start with microfilm, digitizing from microfilm, and we are required to scan at 300, no less than 300 DPI. So it is perfectly capable of that. OCR quality with newspaper in general can be affected by a lot of factors, not just the fact that you started with microfilm. So don't worry that microfilm is going to give you lesser OCR quality than working from your print copy will do, if you have the option between both.
Great, thanks. Second question from Leah. Is there any rough conversion formula between microfilm reduction ratio and DPI?
I have to research that. That's good. There probably is. I would have to look into that. I would have to check to quote specifically, I'd have to check some of the specifications from the Library of Congress. But generally, a sweet spot is probably between like 15x and 20x for reduction ratio is going to yield you. Well, your vendor should always be using 300 or 400 DPI, regardless of what condition your film is in. You shouldn't scan at any less than 300 DPI. But if your reduction ratio is in especially the 15 to 20x range, it's going to lend itself really well to OCR capture at the end. And the DPI, if you're going with that DPI, those reduction ratios, work really well. If you lower your DPI, you could have great film, but if you scan at too low DPI, it's going to not look great in the scan. So it really is, it's a combination of your film and your scanning specifications.
Great.
And we'll talk more about digitization specifications in the later webinar.
Great, thanks, Nicole. The third question, I'm not sure which grant Leah's talking about here, so maybe she can come on and specify, but is curious about whether the grant covers in-house digitization, and if so, what about equipment purchases? Leah, I would say if you're talking about Connecticut Humanities, Operating Support, or SHARP grants here, I believe that it does cover equipment purchases, but if you want to unmute yourself if you're still here and just like say a little bit about what that question is about. I'm not sure. I know that Mike Kamizis from Connecticut Humanities was here at the beginning, but he's not with us anymore. I think if that's a question about a Connecticut Humanities grant, you should talk to Leanne Partridge at CTH about that.
Also, I would also say if you are digitizing from microfilm, I don't recommend doing in-house digitization. The digitization vendors are very well equipped to handle the microfilm, and they can do it at a much lower cost than I think you could do if you were purchasing the equipment and trying to man it yourself. The QC process for microfilm digitization is pretty involved. So if you're digitizing from print copies, it is possible to do an in-house setup. For CDMP, we don't do any in-house. The state library does not do in-house digitization. That is sourced out to a vendor. And again, they have to follow the really strict guidelines from the Library of Congress and NEH through the National Digital Newspaper Program. So yes, for microfilm, I don't recommend trying to do in-house print. That is possible. You have to have probably a very specific setup. And we can, we're not necessarily going to talk about a setup for in-house digitization for print in the later webinars, but if you have questions about that, I could kick ideas around with you. I'm not an expert on that, but I could also point you to some resources on that.
Yeah, and Leanne is the person I'd reach out to, Leah, if you're looking at CTH grant lines for this. But this might be something we can talk about in a future webinar as well as what other grant opportunities are out there.
Yes, we're going to talk about funding. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Excellent. Let me go back here. Susan had a question that was kind of almost a question about scrapbooks, actually. So is it possible to remove news articles which are glued into scrapbooks for digitization? And I would ask, is it a good idea to do that? Or, might you be more interested? Might this be a question about digitizing the scrapbook or otherwise making the scrapbook more accessible?
Exactly. So if the adhesive is not already failing in the scrapbook, then I would not recommend removing it yourself. If you have the funds to have a conservator take the scrapbook apart, then that's something you could look into. Any DCC, Northeast Document Conservation Center, does that sort of work. But if you don't have a conservator or archivist on staff, and even most professional archivists would not attempt to take a scrapbook, like removing adhesives apart. That's not, we always, as I'm an archivist, we parse that out to somebody else. So if the adhesive is not failing, then what I would recommend is then looking at digitizing the scrapbook, and then post digitization with your editing, you can do cropping and just have your newspaper articles. And that's something your vendor, if you end up going with a vendor for that, they could work with you on that cropping. If you do it in-house, that's just something you work into your workflow for post digitization, for post scanning. It's still part of digitization. So yeah, so then I would look at scanning the whole scrapbook page. I would not, if the adhesive has started to fail, you can safely remove. But again, I would get if you have an archivist on staff, they can gauge their comfort level. If you've got another archivist that you work with in any sort of way, get their opinion, and then consider contacting any DCC if you're really looking to dismantle your scrapbook.
Yeah, and Susan, I don't know if you are still here and want to unmute yourself and say a little bit more about the document itself, but I think from a researcher standpoint, a researcher is more likely to be interested in the scrapbook as a historical document rather than any one particular clipping, which could be found in other ways. And so I'm not really sure what the impetus would be for pulling newspaper articles out of scrapbooks in order to digitize them, because then it decontextualizes those clippings, and it's not really clear what brought these clippings together, who was the person who clipped them, why did they do that? All of that contextual information, which a historical researcher would presumably want to know, and that you as a steward of this object is probably how you find value in it, that's all in the context of the scrapbook rather than in the clippings themselves. Exactly. That's just my thoughts on that.
No, and it's archival best practice. If we take a scrapbook apart, whether it be for digitization or because the casing is failing or to have a better storage setup, we maintain the order of the scrapbook and we keep all the items from the scrapbook together. So it's another thing to think about if you need to take it apart, if it's already failing, if you don't have the storage space for a scrapbook, then you want to think about how are you going to maintain the order of the contents of the scrapbook, and how are you going to store it going forward. Again, that's not something we do a lot at the state library, but I can certainly point towards resources. And I know NEDCC has scrapbook webinars, has webinars specific to scrapbooks. So definitely check out. I don't know if they have any that are free, but their stuff is relatively low cost as well.
Yeah, and that's the Northeast Document Conservation
Yes.
Center, nedcc.org is, I think, the
Yes.
URL for that. We can include
Yeah.
a link to that,
Yes.
Emily, I think, in the follow-up.
Yes.
So Barb had a question, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but what sorts of fees do the microfilm companies typically expect to get for use of the masters? I think you said it kind of varied.
It does. Yeah, so ProQuest is the perfect exemplar. Their fees range greatly. So what you just have to do is you have to contact them and say that you want this title and how many reels, and they're gonna give you an estimate, a price quote on what the cost would be. They usually break that down by reel, I believe. I don't know what all goes into these calculations, but we as part of for CDMP, we typically don't end up digitizing titles where the masters are held at ProQuest because it's cost prohibitive for our grant. Like, our grant funds can't absorb the cost to pull those masters. And a lot of other states and that are working as part of the National Digital Newspaper Program have the same issue. We've typically been quoted anywhere from the high 100s, like 250s for reels, but then we've heard other states say that they've been quoted 800-900 more per reel to pull from places like ProQuest. So that's when we now the National Digital Newspaper Program, NEH, and the Library of Congress, the funder and the administrator of NDNP, don't allow us to digitize from service copies unless absolutely necessary. Like, that is the last living copy of a newspaper. So we've never done that for CDNP. But in an instance, what other institutions, people who are not working in this grant program who are digitizing, they have used service copies instead of masters because they cannot afford the ProQuest or other like vendor fees. That's legitimate. That's a legitimate decision as part of your selection and what format you're going to use. That's totally legitimate. It's there. I could say a lot about that, honestly, and it's a huge barrier to making some historic newspapers accessible. And it's really unfortunate, but it's not going to change. It's a fact. So then you just move to looking at service copies. If you don't have print available, check and see if the state library has service copies of your film. The same run that you have. If they do, there's a good chance that they've been handled less. If we do, I work there. There's a good chance those service copies have been handled less than your service copies. So they might be in better shape, might be a little bit better for scanning. But at the end of the day, if you have to use a not great service copy to scan, you have to look at it as, like Amherst was saying, you're making the paper available. You're widening the audience for that newspaper. You're making it more easily available. You're, getting it out there, you're getting it online. So, there are factors. We recommend starting with the master or second generation negative because you're going to have great quality, and quality is not just important for access, but also for long-term digital preservation. But also, a lot of times the purpose of these projects is to increase access and to provide access that is so limited to, take that limitation off. So if you have to go with other things, you have to go with other things. So, but the range can be high. So you have to reach out to ProQuest and you tell them the paper or the town, and they'll give you a quote and you can see. And it's different for every newspaper in every state. There's not a set fee. It's interesting. So yeah.
Interesting. Leah had one more question. Is grayscale still the standard for deliverables if print copies are digitized?
We'll talk more about this in the later webinar, but you can do, I think it's 24-bit color for print. If you're digitizing from print, if you're digitizing from microfilm, you always want to do grayscale. But from print copies, you can do grayscale or color now is the standard. Color is going to cost you more. So something to keep in mind. Color is also going to create larger digital
file.
files. Another thing, if you're tight on storage, if you're having to store yourself or you're using a digital repository that has storage limitations. So just keep that in mind too.
Great, thanks. Are there any other questions? I think we have, a few more minutes left, and we've got Nicole here, we've got Anna here. If people want to, like turn on their cameras, if you have additional questions, we'd welcome them. This is an opportunity to get some expert advice. And thank you again, Allison. P.S. I love your Zoom profile photo. For adding those links to any DCC resources. They're great. Their staff are wonderful. And they do have some free videos available on their website as well. So it's always good to check things out. Okay, Leah, one more question. Where did the coverage only up to 1950 restriction come from? Is that a particular program or did I mishear? That was just a random date that I was making up.
No, but I will say for the National Digital Newspaper Program, which the output of that program is on Chronicling America, we do have a limit up to 1963 for what we're allowed to digitize. And that has to do with copyright, which Hope will probably touch on next week. One thing to think about is past 1963, it's a lot more common for newspapers to be under copyright. So if you are not going to be seeking permission from the copyright holder, which you should be, and you're looking at papers past 1963, we'll talk about that next week, then you might have a cutoff for your dates. But otherwise, no, there's not. If you can get copyright permission, there's no cutoff, unless you just want to institute one yourself. That's another thing that you can use if you're having to make a selection, like you can't digitize everything. Yeah, 1950 is a great time to cut off, in terms of you've gotten up to a good point, you got the big wars in and you kind of hit modern era, if you need a date cut off. That actually 1950 is not bad. So
thank you. Well, I can take credit for that. I mean, I was thinking more to this set of questions about like working with a newspaper that's still in print.
Yes,
what's a date that they might, if you wanted to have rolling wall, a moving wall or something, anything 50 years or older, they'll let you digitize. I was trying to think about ways that you might, work with, a publisher on an arrangement that could increase access, but, also be something that a publisher that's still active might be more comfortable with. It's, like 1950s ancient history to a newspaper.
Exactly.
It's not ancient history to us historians in the room.
Exactly.
But it feels like a long time ago to basically everybody else.
They'll likely favor kind of a mid-century cutoff anyway, if you're working with the publisher. Because think about it this way, they're not going to make money off of anything older than a certain point. They're not looking to make money off of those historic newspapers necessarily. But if it's still under copyright, that is like, there is some monetary value to that. It's an asset to them. Copyright is an asset. But that could be if you're looking for another limiter because you have too much to digitize, you can't afford everything. Picking a date for cutoff could be helpful.
We had another question about how much you think it might cost to just get new service copies from ProQuest and digitize those instead of trying to work with them on masters. Is that kind of a middle of the road option? If you don't have, I think this is coming from the newspaper, from the publisher.
Yeah, that could be more cost effective. I don't know. And I don't know if Anna knows the cost to purchase a service copy from ProQuest. I would imagine that it's cheaper than.
I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a point of clarification when we're saying trying to work with them on masters, what you're actually paying, ProQuest isn't going to let you borrow their masters. What we're talking about is you're paying the costs for them to make you a duplicate of the master that you can then use.
Second generation.
Yeah, the second generation negative.
That is true. I did not point that out. Yeah. That's why it's so expensive, because those are going to be preservation. It's a negative preservation quality copy. So it could be their pricing for service copies could be cheaper and possibly more uniform. I don't know. So that could be a cheaper route. You just have to, I don't know if they'll quote you for service copies after you've asked about the masters. I don't know what they would say for that. I don't know how they try to get, because they really, I mean, these places that have, they want you to go through them and have to spend that money. So I don't know how easy it is to work with them if you're really kind of trying to do a lot of investigating, and because we have only had to ask for very direct pricing before. We haven't had to do a lot of back and forth with them. So I don't know what it's like if you're not negotiating, but just having to really get a lot of information out of them.
ProQuest also might, and I'm not sure about this, they might put restrictions on how you can use their service copies as part of the terms of sale. So that would also be something that you would want to look into. Whereas with the negatives that you would get, the second generation negatives that you would get from them, they will allow you to digitize them based on, I've asked this of them, and what they told me was, you are allowed to digitize as long as you get permission from the publisher.
So yes, that's if you purchase a service copy, they may have something in your purchase agreement or whatever that states that you're not supposed to digitize from that. So I don't know what the likelihood of them is of pursuing any legal action. I've not heard of anyone who's had an instance of that, but something to keep in mind. There might be some liability there. It's really weird with newspaper masters and a quote owner, because they really only own the microfilm. They don't own the newspaper itself. And especially since you're the newspaper, like you own the copyright to this stuff, it's your paper. So it's very murky. And there's a lot of complexities. So yeah.
Well, I think the next webinar seems to be where we're going to be digging into
Yes.
some of those complexities. So I think that's a
Yes.
perfect place to wrap up. I thank all of you for being here, and thanks especially to Nicole and Anna from the Connecticut Digital Newspaper Project at the State Library, and to Emily for all the support that she's been providing here today. Thanks for being here. I think we can stop the recording, and we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar.